to sign in. So good to see you all. While you're waiting, perhaps you'd just like to get Slido ready. You can see the hashtag on the screen now, LM230421. So maybe you'd like to get that sorted out for surveys and questions and so on. And in the chat box, maybe just make a note of who you are, the organization you're from, and where you are in the UK, so we can give Jan an idea of our audience this afternoon. But you're all very welcome. I'm in a particularly good mood today because I've just had the phone call this morning to invite me for my second vaccination tomorrow. So I'll be fully jabbed up by tomorrow lunchtime, which is good news. So people coming in all the time. We'll just give them another minute or so, I think, before we kick off. Let's just have a look and see what we've got at the moment. Yeah, people still coming in. Just bear with us another 60 seconds, and we'll make a start. Just while we wait for a few more people. Hello from Mohammed. And let's see who else we've got in. Mohammed, University of Bath. There's Andrew in Commercial Director, Texo DSI. Jason Peel from Cormac. Hello, Jason. Tim Jones is in. I know Tim very well. Welcome to you, sir. Roy Casey, another good friend of mine from the Midlands. So hello to you all. Thank you for joining us. I think we will make a start. It is now a couple of minutes past. So very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our regular Friday lunchtime webinar brought to you by various parts of Constructing Excellence, CIOB, and the Structural Timber Association. For my sins, I'm Chief Executive of both the Structural Timber Association and CE in the Southwest and the Midlands. And between us, we're delighted to be bringing you these weekly webinars now. We're into our second year, would you believe? So initially, obviously, covering COVID-19 topics, but now covering anything that's important within the UK construction sector. And today is one of those very important topics of supply chain management, supply chain productivity. And I'm delighted to say we have a real expert in that field, Jan Godsall from WMG, University of Warwick. We'll be hearing from Jan in a moment. But before we do so, Howard, would you mind taking us through the house rules, please?
Hi to everyone. Thank you very much, Andrew. Yep, simply we are using Slido, as we've now got used to doing. So for those of you who haven't yet got it, as Andrew said, two ways. You can go to slido.com and you can enter the code, which is LM230421, which is today's date, or you can use the QR reader on your phone. We're going to be using Slido in three ways. We've got a short poll, but today's poll requires some thinking. So I think what we'll do, as I'm talking through, we'll open the poll up and people can start taking the poll. The second way we're going to use Slido is for any questions you have. There is a Q&A part to Slido, so please do type your question into Slido. And if possible, please use that as a means of asking a question rather than chat box. It keeps it in one place. It also allows everyone to actually see the question that's being asked. And indeed, if you think it's a good question and one you would like to ask yourself, you can vote for it, which means it will go up the list. Our final use of Slido today will be a feedback poll, which will just to give feedback on what you thought of today, which is important to us, so we can look at how we can maintain quality and improve on the webinars we do. So I'm going to go through the opening survey now, and it requires you to do a little bit of thinking. So for those of you who started to fill it in, let's look at the first question. What does the term supply chain mean to your organization? So I'm going to give you a moment or two, about a minute, to actually think what it means. And if you'd like to type that in, At the end of this session, we'll also, for some of you who may want to put your thoughts down verbally rather than on paper, we'll open up if anyone wants to, and you can come on screen and share your thoughts with Jan today. So let's go on to the second question. So what does the term lean mean in a construction context? So again, I'll repeat what I'm saying. If you're finding it difficult and you'd rather express yourself verbally, we will, at the end of this, giving the answers, we will come back and you can come up on screen and you can share your thoughts. And the last question is, what percentage of demand for your products your services is predictable? So you all have a different view on this. Okay, so let's go back to the first question. What does the term supply chain mean to your organization? The best way that I can now say this is you should be able to see on your More button a show of hands. If anyone would like to actually say what their definition of this is, please put your hand up and we'll bring you on screen live and you can share that with Jan. Does anyone want to do that? No one seems to be rushing forward here, so I don't see any hands up myself. Abraham, do we seem to have any hands up? I don't see any.
No.
No, do you want to move on to the next question and see if anyone wants to come on screen? What does the term lean mean in a construction context? Have we got anyone who wants to express themselves on that? Again, I can't see any hands up.
Yeah,
so let's go. Oh, one, Tim. Let's bring Tim Jones in, please. Tim, if you wish to open up your microphone, you can say something. If you wish to open up the camera, we can see you. So Tim, you've got your microphone open now. So if you want to say something, please carry on.
Yeah, sorry. I was Howard. I was slow getting going on the supply chain question. Yeah, a really interesting question. Something that in the far southwest we work really hard on. We add one word to it, which is an integrated local supply chain network. And if you phrase it in that way, then you can start identifying what the logical links are to progress successfully from the inception of a construction project to a successful conclusion, whilst hoovering up as much of the economic benefit locally as possible. And there's some really good metrics around measuring this as to the pound spent locally and circulating locally versus the pound that's spent remotely that's exported. So we've got a very good system for evaluating what an integrated supply chain looks like. For us, what we try to do is anticipate a major construction project at least 2 years ahead of when it's actually going to be on the ground, so that you've got the local market ready and aware and equipped to be able to perform. So that would include making sure you've got, if there are particular construction skills, that the training providers were able to respond to that, so that if you need 200 bricklayers or whatever, that you've got a pipeline. But similarly, that the local suppliers are able and willing to respond. So often national supply chains are so elongated that they don't build in the facility to anticipate gearing up for smaller regional businesses. So that's where we from a peninsular perspective would start to try and unpick the whole issue of the importance of a local integrated supply chain.
Okay, Janet, would you like to make any comment on Tim's comment? And also on the screen, there's the feedback of a few people as well. So over to you, Jan.
So if it's okay with everyone, this is something that I will touch upon in my presentation. And so when I get to the relevant, so it's good for me to see these bits because what I can tie them into. So I asked 3 important questions because they link into bits of my presentation. So is it okay if I respond once I get started?
Of course it is. So I don't know if it's possible to roll this a little bit, Abraham, because I think there might be a few more. There we go. So there you go, Janet. You can now see the rest of these.
Awesome. No, that's really, really helpful. Really helpful. And you'll see
Thank
why
you.
I asked the question in a moment.
I'm sure we will. Shall we go to the next question and see what responses we've got then, Abraham?
Yeah. So I will comment here that a question back to everyone else. What's the word that you're seeing lots of here?
W word to me, I think, isn't it?
And we'll come back to that one too. So is there anything else at the bottom?
Yeah, roll it on, Abraham. W word comes up again, but we've got the E and the P words here.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really insightful. Thank you very much.
And the last question then, please, Abraham.
Ooh.
We have a good diversity of views here.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting, and we'll come back to this one too. So thank you very, very much. And you'll see, I know my questions perhaps are a bit more challenging, but you'll see where they tie in and why I asked them.
Thanks very much, Janet. Okay, Abraham. So if I'll pass you now back to Andrew. Andrew, so back to you.
Okay, Howard, thank you very much. Well, really all it leaves me to do now is to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Professor Jan Godsall from WMG, University of Warwick. Just to say, Jan, that supply chain has been, if you like, front and center for what we've been doing within Constructing Excellence, certainly for 20 plus years. It's been the mainstay of our agenda. And we've put a huge importance upon it, particularly in the Southwest, where I've been working all through that time through a good friend of mine, Martin Jones. And it was he that suggested that we invite you today to give of your time and your knowledge. So I thank you for that. And I think with further ado, I will just hand over to you, Jan. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jan Godsall. I'm a Professor of Operations and Supply Chain Strategy at WMG, as was mentioned earlier. But perhaps what I should also say is that I'm not your average academic. So I'm an engineer by background and spent most of my early career actually in industry working for AstraZeneca. And then actually within the region, I worked for Dyson when Dyson was a scale-up organisation, so about 25 years ago. And although I've been an academic for over 20 years now, I'm a very practical academic, and all of my work actually looks at, is led by industry and solving industry's problems. Now, one of the things that I'm also is industry agnostic. So I am not a construction expert, but I have done quite a lot of work on large infrastructure projects, particularly again in the Southwest with the MOD, looking particularly at submarines and warships. And there are quite a lot of parallels, I'd argue, between certain aspects of construction and large infrastructure projects. And on the other side of things, I do a lot of work in more traditional manufacturing supply chains for all sorts of products. And depending on where you sit in the supply chain and whether you're actually more of a manufacturer of components and products that go into construction supply chains, then some of my expertise may be more relevant to you there. But one of the reasons why I like to work in this way, and one of the things that's absolutely fascinated me about construction, if you come back to this quote from Jung, you know, everyone you meet knows something you don't know, but need to know and learn from them. And perhaps you could see that from my questions that I originally posed to you at the start. I think one of the fascinating things that I found working in construction, particularly over the last 2 years where I've been part of the Transform Construction Network Plus, my colleagues on that Network Plus from UCL and from Imperial, you know, they would see themselves as, you know, their raison d'etre is to do research and to support the construction industry. Whereas I very much was brought in because I actually see that my work's around manufacturing and supply chains, and I see construction as a context. And I found it really, really interesting because I've been fascinated to see and to take principles from other industries, particularly things like fast-moving consumer goods, and see how they could apply in a construction context. And maybe part of the reason I got involved in the Transform Construction project in the first place is that we actually did that very thing using an Innovate UK collaborative R&D grant with Costain about 5 years ago, where we tried to take these principles from fast-moving consumer goods and see how they could apply to the Costain supply chains for their customers, both into water infrastructure. And we were looking actually at the relationship with the then 820 Alliance, and then also for road infrastructure, working with Highways England. And so I hope what we're going to have this afternoon is a conversation. So I'm very happy if Howard can work out how to see you and you put your hands up, or even if you just take your mic off and ask a question directly for the session to be interactive. Because for me, this is as much about me learning from you as it is perhaps you learning from me, particularly given that I'm not a construction expert, but my expertise is in supply chain. So coming back to my first question, which is what does supply chain mean to your organisation and to construction? One of the things that I think first struck me or became more and more apparent, both with the work we did initially with Costain, but then actually through the Transform Construction Network Plus. And this actually mirrors some other industries too, is that the word supply chain is actually really, really poorly understood. Now, in academia, academics are notorious for wanting to reinvent the wheel, but in supply chain, we're particularly bad because 1 in 5 academics papers that's written, the academic starts by redefining the word supply chain. And actually, in construction supply chains, the word supply chain gets bandied about a lot. But from my experience, in the majority of cases, what an organisation is talking about when they talk about supply chain is actually their supply base. And if you're a larger contractor, what you're often talking about really is managing your procurement or your supply base. So really, it very much focuses on that. Because one of the things that's very, very different about a construction project versus perhaps a typical manufacturing process, a manufacturing process tends to have an end customer, but quite often within a construction project, there is a construction or civil engineering firm that is coordinating a number of different streams. And traditionally in manufacturing supply chains, we talk really about the flow of material, information, and cash. But actually, in a construction context, yes, you have to manage the material supply chain, but you're also very concerned about the labour supply chain, the equipment supply chain, and also the supply chain for professional services. In addition, you're probably managing the flow of information and cash for each of those different streams. And that's something that's quite different to traditional manufacturing, where we predominantly just focus on looking at the materials supply chain. And therefore, when we start to look in a construction context about the roles that a supply chain manager could play, this is where we see some real significant differences. And so if we've got our 4 different flows at the core, you know, materials, labour, equipment, and professional services, as I was just alluding to, by far the most common role that we see supply chain manager playing in construction is that I would describe as a supplier or a supply-based management role. And interestingly, this is very, very similar in some other industries that are dominant within your region, such as aerospace and an industry that's quite dominant in the region where Warwick's based, which is automotive industry. So people quite often think that the aerospace and automotive industries are sort of exemplar in terms of their supply chains. I'd potentially argue not, because traditionally they're very, very procurement driven industries that have a very traditional and perhaps narrower view of what supply chain management is. And it really, really focuses on supplier or supply-based management. And quite often this can also be in quite an exploitative way, because really there's a focus on cost down and not necessarily value add. A second role that can be played is looking at the focus of resource flow between perhaps the construction or civil engineering firm and those 4 resource flows. And actually, if I look at some of the work we were doing within Costain, there was perhaps some elements of people that had a role that was looking at supply or supply-based management, and then other people that, once those contracts had been set up, really focused on the flow of then material onto the construction site. Some organisations combine the two together, so they have integrated resource flow management. But perhaps what we see more in other industries, such as fast-moving consumer goods, is this concept of a supply chain as end-to-end supply chain management. And actually, Tim, in his explanation, it sounds like what you try to do in the Southwest. And I love the use of the word integration, because actually this is all about supply chain integration, going right the way back to the, should I say, famous or infamous Egan report, really, is that fundamentally what we should be trying to do is not optimize the efficiency or effectiveness of an individual firm, but it sounds like what you're trying to do in the Southwest is very much what we should be trying to do, which is trying to optimize the performance of that end-to-end supply chain. But interestingly, from my experience of construction, people that are using the term that they're a supply chain manager, but as I said, more often than not, really what they're doing is some kind of strategic supplier management. So, and that's tending to link to some kind of procurement. Whereas end-to-end supply chain management, if you want to do what Tim's talking about, it requires coordination. It requires coordination to enable integration, and actually it requires a slightly different skill set to procurement. It actually requires much more of a planning skill set. And maybe just reflecting on one of the biggest differences I've seen perhaps between construction and more of a traditional manufacturing context. Perhaps in a more traditional manufacturing context, if I think of my time at Dyson, Dyson had a fairly equal respect for people that were project or program managers as it did for people that were supply chain or operations managers. Whereas the dominant skill set I see within construction is around project and program management. The skill around supply chain is perhaps not respected in quite the same way. Because fundamentally, and this comes right the way back to Tim's goal around integration, one of the best ways to actually achieve integration is to actually think of things from a much more process orientated perspective. And actually at the highest level within your businesses, but potentially even across your businesses across the Southwest, is to actually think about things from a business process perspective. And business processes have 5 critical key characteristics. The first is that they have a customer for whom they create value. And so in a sense, that's the thing behind which you can all orientate. They will cross both functional and, I think in your case within the Southwest, both organisational boundaries. And then they will draw upon resources, both from those functions within a single firm, but across those different firms within your network to be team-based and have strategic goals. And why this is important is because business processes are fundamental to delivering competitive advantage. Now, many of you will have heard of the work of Michael Porter. I quite often joke and say, you know, all these clever people write news stuff about strategy, but not a lot has really changed since the 1980s. I mean, the 1980s was when Michael Porter was first talking about competitive advantage, competitive strategy, and introducing us to the sort of broader concept of a value chain, which is akin to that sort of idea of end-to-end supply chain management I'm describing. But it was also the era at which the term supply chain itself was first defined. And I'd argue not a lot has really changed since the 80s. We've just not been particularly good at implementing what appear to be quite simple principles. And Michael Porter, if you look at those red sort of bars on the outside, essentially argued there's two ways you're going to compete. You're going to compete through differentiation or having something pretty unique in terms of how you add value, or you're going to compete through cost leadership, which is by being the cheapest. And Michael was at Harvard, but he had some other clever colleagues at Harvard, some guys called Tracy and Weissima, who sort of just built on Michael's work and said, you know what, though, if you're going to differentiate your stuff, there's two ways that you can differentiate it. You can differentiate it by having some product innovation, or you can differentiate it by having what we call customer intimacy. And that's by having unique insights into what the customer wants, which enable you to leverage those insights and to deliver customer value in a way that your competitors can't. And increasingly, actually, you don't necessarily compete just through one of those two dimensions. And in fact, it's the argument of Tracy and Weissima that if you look at those green bars of product innovation, customer intimacy, and the third of which is operational excellence, which is akin to cost leadership, but it's really about making sure that your organization is as effective and efficient as possible. What Tracy and Weissima argue is that if you want to compete, you have to be as good as your competitors in all three areas, and then you're going to gain competitive advantage by being better than your competitors in at least one. And what this essentially says, and actually we've done a number of different surveys of manufacturing firms across Europe, if you were to give a manufacturing firm 100 points against which to divide those based on where they put their strategic focus between operational excellence, product innovation, and customer intimacy, what you find is at least 40 of those points go to operational excellence, because firms need to be effective and efficient in what they do to create that bedrock from which they can leverage either their product innovation or customer intimacy to gain competitive advantage. And I raise this because essentially, if you look in again to the blue boxes, there are three core business processes that underpin any organization, and they link into those Tracy and Weissima value drivers. And those three core business processes are new product development, customer relationship management, and supply chain management. And ironically, nearly every organization I've worked for, I came out of the pharma industry with AstraZeneca, I then worked for Dyson, and James is incredibly focused in this area. But both of those organizations, and I strongly suspect your own organizations, have quite well defined new product development processes. Equally, you probably have a good, maybe to a lesser extent, developed CRM process for understanding how you interface with your customers. But what we tend to find is that there is a paucity, in fact, hardly any organizations which truly embrace the concept of thinking about supply chain management as an end-to-end business process. In fact, there's only one organization that I've come across, and I work with a lot of organizations, that has actually organized their business in this way, and it's the German manufacturer Beiersdorf. And they have actually created four core business processes. They have new product development, CRM, supply chain management, and being a fast-moving consumer goods company, they also have brand management because their brands are incredibly important to their business too. And what Beiersdorf do, they have a classic org structure, which would be functions and regions. They're a global multinational organization. But on top of that, they actually have a business process organization, which strives to do those five things we saw in the slide before. It will start with delivering value to the customer. And then essentially it's an organizational layer that then sucks the resources out of their business to make sure they're delivering that customer value. And in doing so, they have metrics where about a third of them are customer facing, a third are business facing, and a third of those metrics would focus on the performance of functions or their own individual firms. And this is not something that is very commonplace. As I say, the only organisation that I know personally that's doing it is Beiersdorf. But from further survey work that we've done, actually asking organisations about their design and thinking about how it enables this end-to-end thinking, actually only 17% of organisations have built this type of thinking into their org design, and so are doing it. And you could argue, well, then that's a bad thing, but what I'd argue for you guys is that's a huge opportunity. And it sounds like you're already one step ahead in the Southwest, actually thinking about this degree of coordination, because it's a way that you can potentially gain competitive advantage within your marketplace. Because what we should be encouraging the supply chain to do is to improve productivity by enabling flow, and that end-to-end orientation enables you to do it. And as I've just alluded to, organisational structure and the way that you actually think about your business is a critical way of doing this. Because if your goal is to be integrated, then fundamentally to be integrated, you have to break down those functional silos, and you need to break those silos down both within your own organisation, but between the organisations that you want to link to. The second thing to enable you to do that is integrated planning. And actually planning is the glue that holds a supply chain together. And planning is probably the capability that is most lacking in supply chains, not just in construction, but across all manufacturing in the UK. And if we think about it, if you think about things from a supply chain professionalism perspective, we have the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply, who predominantly focus on that sort of procurement and supply-based management angle. And actually within construction, you have lots of different bits that are started to really major on that procurement angle. And I know I was talking to Anne Broadbent, and she would argue that actually her view of procurement expands to be this much more holistic view of supply chain. But my pushback to her was, well, that's just confusing people, isn't it? Because if you mean procurement, talk procurement. If you mean end-to-end supply chain, talk end-to-end supply chain. Otherwise, you're just going to confuse the entire construction industry. And it was sort of feedback that she sort of took on board. And if you're looking at things like logistics, then we have the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation. If you want to really focus on perhaps manufacturing expertise, it's IET, IMechE. But planning, we don't have a Chartered Institute of Planning, though in America, they have the Council of Supply Chain Management Professionals, because about 25 years ago, CILT, SIPS, and the sort of manufacturing orientated professional bodies all came together to create one entity that actually looks at supply chain. But we don't have that in the UK, and we don't have it in Europe. But actually, integrated planning is critical to supply chain integration. And I am sure that some of the work that Tim must be doing in the Southwest is about creating that network and integrating planning across it. And what I'll come on to do in a moment is to then talk to you about some aspects of how you might need to plan that demand. Because what you therefore require is better visibility. And ideally, you want better visibility of the demand that's coming, but you also want better visibility of how your network is performing, so that you can integrate your supply chain in real time and get visibility of what's happening end to end in real time. Because fundamentally, to be effective and efficient, depending on the demand signal that your particular supply chain is seeing, you need to have the right buffers in place. And let me put it like this. Let's just think about COVID-19. We as the UK were obsessed about running out of toilet paper. To a lesser extent, things like batteries and paracetamol and hand sanitizer. But what made it to the news was our potential national shortage of toilet paper. And I put it to you that we were never, ever going to run out of toilet paper, because actually fast-moving consumer supply chains have pretty good visibility, and they knew exactly where all the toilet paper was. On top of that, we, just as a result of COVID, weren't suddenly going to start going to the toilet more often. We didn't actually need more toilet paper. We were just worried about running out. We, as humans, were displaying what we call myopic loss aversion. We were worried we were going to run out of toilet paper, and hence we overreacted. And whilst there was warnings from even Boris Johnson to not panic and just to buy in normal rates, we didn't adhere to that. And so in the short term, supermarkets rationed what we could have. And the reason, so essentially what they were able to do, and the reason why we were never going to run out of toilet paper is that there was inventory in the system to be able to compensate. And on top of that, for certain other products, the manufacturers also knew that they had spare manufacturing capacity, another buffer that they could actually turn on extra shifts, run overtime to actually produce more if more was actually required. So that effective buffer management actually enabled us to survive COVID pretty well for many day-to-day products. And in fact, one of the organisations that I work incredibly closely with, Tata Consumer Products Limited, you'd know them for Tetley Tea, because they had been working with us on their buffer management strategy around balancing spare inventory and manufacturing capacity, they were able to respond better than their competitors. And without being exploitative, they went from third to first in the UK tea market as during this period. Because I asked you what lean meant, and I think Andrew quite rightly commented that the word that seemed to come out the most was a word that began with W, which was waste. Unfortunately, since lean, I suppose, first emerged as a concept that came out of the Toyota production system, we perhaps have lost our way a little bit in terms of thinking about what lean really is. And lean, I think, exists within organisations at 3 levels. And at the top level, lean is a philosophy which is underpinned by 5 principles. And I think there's probably a common theme to everything that I'm going to share with you this afternoon, in that everything starts with understanding customer value, or it starts with the customer. And the 5 lean principles essentially say you need to understand customer value to develop value streams. And there's very purposely an S on the end of value streams, because what it's assuming is that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work, because actually customers value different things. And from my perspective, and if you think about demand, fundamentally customers will create different demand patterns. And so if you want to adopt the 3rd lean principle, which is about making it flow, then fundamentally you need to understand the demand patterns, and then you develop a different value stream for each of those different demand patterns, so that the rate of flow is in line with the rate of demand, which is essentially the 4th of those principles, which is at the pull of the customer. Now, the last lean principle says in pursuit of perfection. And this is perhaps where we've seen a lot of lean initiatives take place, because this is around the continuous improvement aspect. But the continuous improvement aspect is perhaps in some organisations the only thing that we've seen taking place. And this is a sort of, perhaps we've seen this as bottom up, and this is where the W word comes in, where we've seen perhaps lean come in through consultants who take a particular activity and then they try to make that activity as efficient and effective as possible by using continuous improvement techniques, as opposed to starting right at the top level, the highest level in your organisation really, and starting with lean as a philosophy and thinking about what it means in terms of creating flow that's at the pull of the customer, that's supported by the right value streams. Because fundamental to all of this, and to enable Tim to do his job well in terms of trying to coordinate what's going on in the Southwest, you fundamentally need to understand the demand patterns. And I was really interested by your answers to this question. And I'd love to follow up more to actually understand a bit more about which organisations answered in which way. So there is one thing that is absolutely true. So the person that said everything's unpredictable, the one thing that is true is that change is the only constant. And what I would say is that in terms of if you are trying to predict maybe demand at a very individual level, perhaps that could be inherently unpredictable. But actually, over the last 20 years, in all of the different organisations that I've worked with, including some of the totally weird ones, like looking at the maintenance of warships and submarines, I have yet to find an organisation that, when we, in a data-driven way, have sought to look for patterns of demand, I haven't found at least 60, if not 70% of stable demand. Because fundamentally, if we go back to the Tracy and Wyseema's view of how you're going to deliver value, if you want to have operational excellence that's going to underpin a strategy of innovation or differentiation going forward, you need to have developed your business's strategy in a way that gives you 60 to 70% stable demand, so that your business has a stable base from which it can build. It then will free up your management headroom to be able to deal with that more unpredictable element of your demand. And I think one of the things that totally surprised me when I was doing the work with Costain, and it wasn't just a Costain phenomena, is that everyone in the construction industry says they want to be innovative, and everyone wants to compete by being innovative. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's a lot of activities that we require within construction that actually are a more commodity type activity, that are actually very, very repeatable, that happen many, many, many times, that could be planned in a very, very different way, that actually would give us what we call economies of repetition. But what it requires is a mindset shift to actually think about planning it in that way. And so if I think about my example with Costain dealing with Thames Water, the reason why things like AMP periods were created, and actually in the MOD, they created something similar called the FOM and the COM, and actually their planning period, they increased their planning horizon to 20 years, was that the idea that if you gave people a longer planning horizon, they could plan better. And so actually they could find this base level of demand, and then they could coordinate and organise and integrate their supply chains accordingly. But what that requires, and there's an old Eastern European adage that a dead fish rots from the head. And I don't mean to be rude, but your clients right at the head of your supply chains, they are the head of the fish. And we need them to be planning savvy, and we need them to understand that they essentially need to set the drumbeat and set the value streams for the entire supply chain. Because if those clients at the top of the chain, and in my water example, essentially, because of the way that the client was planning, they were releasing projects, and the client was planning in this way because they believed there was uncertainty. They believed that there was budgetary uncertainty, and they could only confirm a budget. I suppose they could only release projects really every 3 months. Now, although the likes of Costain have been able to set up wonderful framework agreements, if demand is only being released in 3-month buckets, then essentially you can have all the framework agreements in the world, but it's very, very hard to bring them to life because you're only getting demand in a very lumpy, periodic way. If Thames Water, the client in that case, could have said, you know what, yes, we do have some fiscal uncertainty, but equally, that's probably around 20-30% of our demand. What we do know is that we have this programme of work that we absolutely have to deliver over the next 5 years. So why don't we release that as a programme of work and actually give people the 5-year visibility for that element of the work? Let's create a base level programme from which we can then get both our construction companies to then plan that accordingly, and then bring their framework agreements together so that everybody in that supply chain can actually benefit from that 5-year visibility and actually create what we'd call some economies of repetition. And competition can still exist, because if people perform well in those frameworks, better than others, then they may gain a bit more market share. But equally, if everyone's performing well, then the whole thing can continue. But what that will enable is, rather than those supply chains having to plan an activity periodically as they come, it enables the entire supply chain to be able to plan those over a 5-year planning horizon and get some periodicity to it and some certainty. And then that emergent work, you know, the stuff where they actually really couldn't predict what was going to happen, that's where people can be innovative. That's where you might actually not even want to give people just a contract for the design and then the build, but actually work more collaboratively to actually identify early on who's the best person to bring innovation in through a design and build type of contract. Because fundamentally, and this was perhaps where we could see a way to bring together the principles of supply chain management and project management, which is your dominant language in construction, is that in a normal manufacturing context, we'd argue that you need to find the base demand. Perhaps a better way of saying this in your context is, how can you find those economies of repetition? And how can your clients contract with you and set up the conditions to enable the entire supply chain to find those economies of repetition? Because if you think about it, it is far, far better, for instance, for the likes of Costain to be able to identify the same activity that was going to happen across their, for instance, if we were to take the Southwest, if you were doing a water infrastructure upgrade over 5 years in the Southwest, it would be far better to be able to identify those common projects and then run that as one programme of repetitive projects across the Southwest than it would be to review those as 20 discrete projects that essentially get managed as 20 discrete projects. And so our sort of contribution in a way before was that it was viewed that really project managers either viewed projects as a single project, or in terms of traditional projects, you may have divided a project into sub-projects, which you then managed. Or there'd be concepts around multiple project management, where you may be managing a range of different projects within a portfolio. But what we'd argue is, how can your clients give you work in a way that enables you either for the entire project to be able to repeat it over a period of time, or if it doesn't work quite at the overall project layer, at least as a module or an activity layer beneath that, how could you start planning over a bigger planning horizon so that you can start actually thinking about the entire construction process much more as a sort of distributed manufacturing network. And interestingly, when we looked at this for Costain, what we actually identified, and we had to do this process manually. There's sort of, I know we're now getting into the realms of one of my colleagues at Warwick, Professor Naomi Brooks, is really pioneering the sort of idea of project data analytics. We had to do this analysis manually, but when we actually took the projects that were placed onto Costain and looked within those for to see whether or not those projects were either fully or partially repeatable, overall we found that 84% of the projects within the portfolio were predictable and 56% were repeatable, around 49% wholly. And what that essentially demonstrated, that there is a real opportunity within construction to start to think about things in a very, very different way. But what it actually requires, as I said, is the clients or the customer at the start of that chain to recognise this, and in essence to plan and release demand in a way that gives the supply chain a chance to orientate around that. And so fundamentally, what we tried to do actually through the Transform Construction Network Plus was to be able to start to summarise this into a little digest. So we actually wrote a digest called Supply Chain Productivity and Construction, and you can download that, and it's a sort of summary of some of the stuff that I've been saying. But what's absolutely critical, and I come right away back to what Tim said at the start, is that what we have to focus on is building end-to-end supply chain integration. As someone who lives in Stroud, I'm also particularly gratified that you want to do that in the Southwest, and it's fantastic to see you starting to think about the Southwest in that way. What I'd argue, though, what's critical is to work with the customer at the end of the chain to find ways to therefore plan those supply chains so that you, across that supply chain, can identify those economies of repetition. And yes, we had to do it manually in our exercise. But what I would argue is that there are ways in which we can use relatively simple project data analytics and different types of digital technologies to actually help us identify those economies of repetition and to be able to improve supply chain planning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan, very much. Thank you. If you'd like to stop sharing, that's fabulous. So have we any questions, please, to bring up on the screen, Abraham? Because what we'd like to do now, Jan, if we can, is open it up to our listeners and answer any questions or queries they may have. So could you bring some up on the screen for us, Abraham, if we have any from Slido? Let me just check my Slido here on my phone. Right.
No, I don't see any.
I don't see any either, actually. So that's very surprising. So, ladies and gents, don't be shy. Please come forward. We've still got another 10 minutes left. So I'd like to utilize Jan's time as wisely as we can. Jan, while others are sort of getting the courage to put a question forward, as I mentioned in my introduction, supply chain management initiatives have been at the heart of what we've been trying to achieve within Constructing Excellence for a long time. And my involvement has been since the Egan report of 1998. Have you seen any positive moves in that direction, may I ask?
So this is perhaps, and maybe I've not been looking at the right examples. And it also, I think it depends on which of those definitions of supply chain that you're taking.
Right.
So I think there's been, if you were to look at that supply-based management view, there's been loads done around the sort of improving the procurement processes and that side of thing. And I think probably also in terms of sort of the integrated resource management piece. I think to bring Tim's vision to life and to really bring the Egan report sort of vision to life of true end-to-end integration, I think you're a way off that, but not just your sector, but many other sectors too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, you know, from my experience, we've had several goes at it in that time. And then we get a recession, say, and we all revert to type. And, you know, we've called it various things over the years: partnering, collaborative working, supply chain management. But we seem to go back, we revert to type.
And I think the way to look at it, you know, the best people to ask about whether they think they've got an integrated supply chain would be the SMEs or the people that are in that supply chain at the lower tiers, because they're the ones that take the brunt of this variability, having to respond at short notice, perhaps being pressured on price, having to assume the risk. Whereas if you're managing it truly end to end, then actually, in a way, those smaller suppliers, they should know that they've got an order book for the next 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah,
they should be able to plan their resources in an effective and efficient way.
Yeah, we've got pockets of brilliance, I think, Jan, within the sector, but I don't think we've hit the rump of the industry yet. I know I did a project with Martin Jones, who may be on the call, from University of West of England, nearly 20 years ago now, because we were asked why, when the Egan report was issued, why we had partnering, as it was called in those days, with clients and consultants and contractors, but actually the subcontractors, tier 2, 3, and so on, and the manufacturers weren't involved. And the blockage within this report, we actually found, was the main contractor, who actually didn't want that supply chain to go beyond them because they wanted to keep them sweet, so to speak. Anyway, we've got a proper question in, so I'm delighted to say, are problems in the supply chain in engineering and construction due to the fact that engineering and construction projects are bespoke?
So, this was actually something that we discussed quite a lot as part of the Transform Construction Network Plus. So if you think about something, and quite a lot of as you'll know, quite a lot of, I suppose, construction leading practices seem to come out of big projects that are very bespoke, like Terminal 5. But what Terminal 5 did is actually look beneath what looks like it's a bespoke project for those economies of repetition, a more modular or material level, and plan accordingly. I think you can tackle the problem from two ends. I think there will be some projects which are genuinely bespoke and require something to be very customizable. But actually, I think there's perhaps a change in thought, which is saying, there's probably a lot of things that we think need to be bespoke, but actually, can we design them in a more modular way? And again, these aren't new concepts. These are the things that have been around for years and years and years. So that while something can appear, so that we talk about in manufacturing, it's the difference between variety and complexity. You may want to give the impression of offering variety, but you design it in a way, perhaps using a more platform-based approach, that actually enables the supply chain behind it not to be subject to complexity, and be able to organize itself in an effective and efficient way.
And of course, that platform-based approach is very much at the heart of what the Construction Innovation Hub is doing at the moment. Let's have the next question, Abraham, shall we?
We have no more written questions.
Oh, we have. Yes.
Oh, okay.
We have. Yep.
We have people who've got their hands up, Andrew. That you might want to bring in.
Let's get the questions underway. Otherwise, we won't fit it all in. We've only got 6 minutes left. So let's deal with this one from Susanna, if we may. There are so many digital technologies for companies to choose. Where are the best guidance sources and services to discern what is actually best?
So I am probably not the best person to answer this question. I think for this one, you might want to go to something like the Construction Innovation Hub. And that's because my expertise would be around the planning systems that were to coordinate and optimize that, rather than some of the digital technologies that you might be using for things like BIM or other stuff. So sorry, Susanna.
Okay, let's have the next question then, please, Abraham. How can the construction industry utilize the supply chain philosophy in retrofitting domestic properties where the clients are individuals?
So I think this would be at a material level, and also from if you think about it, you know, those different flows, professional services, labour, materials. So I think you'd have to view this perhaps more as giving people continuity of contracts, perhaps for the professional service or for the work, and maybe even trying to think about retrofitting activities in a sort of modular sense, so that there'll always be a degree of variability, but what you're trying to do is to increase that base level of demand. So I think something like retrofit could be planned in a way that gives it a degree of stability. And I think a lot of this links into contracting. We work with Pinson Masons, a legal firm, on this. It is both about giving people longer term contracts and contracts that enable more appropriate risk sharing.
Okay, thank you. And the next question, Abraham. When you look at supply chain management and consider typical ops, commercial support business units for an SME, where would you recommend sourcing the internal resource?
So if you're an SME, I'd actually say for planning, you could maybe use a contract service. So a number of SMEs I know, say for instance, for something like finance, they might have a part-time finance director who they buy in. And I wonder whether or not, and this is maybe even a service you could offer in the Southwest, is because planning is something that actually, especially if you're an SME, it's not someone that you could necessarily afford someone to be permanently doing. But if you were to club together and operate it as a service for the Southwest, because proper planning will free up loads of cash for your business, because it'll make sure you've got the right inventory, you're utilising your manufacturing capacity right, you're just generally planning. So actually this is one where that planning capability for SMEs, I wonder whether there's a way of doing sort of planning as a service and buying into it in a more cost-effective way than necessarily having it residing within your own organisation. Okay,
and I think we've got one more question before Howard we bring anyone in. No, we've got one more or two more. Is not a barrier to the wider use of, would it be helpful to differentiate between agile and lean supply chain management?
Okay, so the previous one, I would say you need to have better customers. So the supply chain does rot from the fish. So actually, if you really want to do supply chain improvement, ideally it starts with the customer, and they would actually embark on a set of projects with their whole end-to-end supply chain to try to create that uplift. In terms of what lean or agile, so that's one of my sort of areas of expertise. Lean is the supply chain strategy you use when you've got stable demand. So it's what you'd use in the baseline situation, because it essentially means you can minimize your buffers. Agile is a supply chain response when actually you have to plan in a different way because demand is less certain. And if you're going to adopt an agile rather than lean approach, it will always cost more pound for pound because you have to have bigger buffers.
Okay. And I've got one more question. Is not a barrier to wider use of SCM, supply chain management?
You know, I said yes. So this is where you need your customers to be more understanding at the front end and actually see their role as coordinating and leading a supply chain from a planning perspective. And essentially part of the problem here is they view the supply chain from a procurement perspective, not a planning perspective. So customer education. So the best way you could use me is to get Highways England, you know, those big customers at the front to think differently, to plan differently, and to think about their work differently.
Okay. Howard, I don't think we're going to have a chance to bring anyone online. We've only got a minute to go. And I just need to, yes, this slide is what I need to go through. So if you'd like a CPD certificate for what you've heard for the last 60 minutes, please go to www.mypropass.co.uk. And here's today's code, CE454. If you type that in at that web address, then you will you'll get your CPD certificate. Next week at this same time, 12 o'clock, we're going to be listening to Alan Willan from Glenaghan. He's an economist, and he's going to be taking us through the road to recovery from an economics point of view, with some interesting statistics, which I think you will find really useful. It's now 1 o'clock. It just leaves me to thank Howard and to thank Abraham from Leaders Meets for hosting our weekly webinar so well. And obviously to thank you, Jan, for giving of your time and your knowledge so freely. And I think you could judge from the quality of the questions that everyone was most interested in what you had to say. So thank you very much. The sun is shining down here in the southwest. I'm going to enjoy my afternoon and get ready for my second jab tomorrow. But right now, I'm going to wish you a very good afternoon. I'll see you all next week. Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Thanks, Jan.